Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, and in many ways that's seen as sort of an unavoidable response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but the German declaration of war didn't actually mention the Japanese at all. Instead, it listed 3 United States destroyers, the USS Greer, the USS Kearny, and the USS Reuben James, as reasons that Germany was going to war with the United States. Those 3 ships, and what at the time were called incidents, represent a nearly forgotten part of U.S. history, and that is the undeclared war that came before the Second World War. It is history that deserves to be remembered. By the mid-1930s, war clouds were already on the horizon throughout the world. In the United States, the prevailing mood was isolationism and non-interventionism. The U.S. involvement in World War I had been costly, and the national attitude, and the attitudes of powerful members of Congress, was that the U.S. must be prevented from being dragged into another European war. The Congress passed neutrality acts starting in 1935, intended to prevent the nation trading with powers at war. But the 1930s, starting with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935, would test the nation's ability to remain neutral in a time of conflict. The slow drift towards war accelerated after the September 1st, 1939 German invasion of Poland. The invasion, ostensibly predicated over a dispute regarding the free city of Danzig, had sparked a broader war. France and Britain had joined military agreements with Poland, largely in an attempt to force a diplomatic solution. But when diplomacy failed and Germany invaded, both were obliged to enter the war. Roosevelt understood that the outbreak of war would include, as it had in World War I, a conflict over shipping in the Atlantic. Despite the isolationist attitude at home, Roosevelt wanted to help Britain as much as possible, without outright violating neutrality. On September 5th, Roosevelt announced an air and sea neutrality patrol. He claimed that the intent of the patrol was to monitor the actions of belligerent ships, and October 7th was joined by the foreign ministers of the American republics in what was called the Panama Declaration, which designated a patrol zone that extended between 200 and 300 miles from the shores of North and South America. The patrolling was done by a task force that included both the Navy and the Coast Guard. If the patrols sighted a U-boat, they were not allowed to attack, but they could monitor and radio its location to British and Canadian forces. In addition, Roosevelt convinced Congress to amend the Neutrality Act to allow so-called cash and carry sales. This provision allowed the sale of goods to a belligerent nation so long as they picked them up from an American port and transported them themselves. In theory, this allowed sales to both sides without threatening neutrality, but as Britain had a large enough navy to prevent German trade, the provision in practice only helped the Allies. U.S. neutrality was looking less and less neutral. The boundary was further tested in September 1940 when Roosevelt signed an executive agreement with Britain called Destroyers for Bases. The agreement traded 50 older U.S. destroyers to the British in exchange for land rights on certain British possessions. The destroyers taken from a reserve fleet were outdated, they were in poor repair, and of little use in the ongoing battle to protect shipping in the Atlantic. In fact, Churchill saw them as virtually useless, but agreed to the deal since he knew that U.S. support was needed after France had fallen to Germany in June. The base's rights supposedly enhanced U.S. defense, but the agreement really allowed the U.S. to take up some defensive responsibilities for places like the Bahamas, freeing Britain to redeploy troops to the war, as well as to allow the U.S. to finance base improvements like airfields that could then be used by the British. Again, Roosevelt was overtly helping the Allies while still pretending neutrality. But cash and carry was pressing its limits. As Britain, who with its empire was bearing the weight of the conflict after the fall of France, was running short of assets that could be used to provide the cash. Churchill sent a 15-page letter to Roosevelt, which was ironically delivered on December 7th, 1940, pressing for help. U.S. opinion was slowly shifting, but not to the point of supporting war. However, the nation was becoming more positively disposed towards Britain. Providing aid was seen as a way to fund the war against Germany without having to fight it ourselves. In March, FDR signed the bill that was popularly called Lend-Lease. The act allowed the U.S. to provide billions in aid, initially to Britain and China, making the U.S. an indirect participant in the war. Lend-Lease was extended to the Soviet Union after Germany invaded on June 22nd. As the Lend-Lease aid represented a substantial investment, Roosevelt then had a reason to extend the Neutrality Patrol to protect that investment. In July, the U.S. agreed to take over the occupation of Iceland, an agreement that required a formal request from the government of Iceland, which again allowed a redeployment of British troops, but also further extended the U.S. zone in the Atlantic. Eventually, the zone for the Neutrality Patrol extended 3/4 of the way across the Atlantic. Well, technically, under the terms of the Neutrality Treaty, U.S. forces were not allowed to attack Axis forces without being shot at first. The U.S. was, in practice, doing convoy escort, a crass violation of neutrality. The U.S. was, in essence, fighting an undeclared war. On April 10th, the Gleaves-class destroyer USS Niblack was picking up survivors from a Dutch ship that had been sunk by a U-boat when it got a sound contact that suggested that a submarine was, according to the action report, rapidly approaching a position for attack. The Niblack released a depth charge over the target. That attack appears to have been the first action between the United States and German forces in the Second World War. 8 months before war was officially declared. U.S. public support had significantly shifted by mid-1941. A Gallup poll showed more than 2/3 thought it was more important that Germany be defeated than that the U.S. stay out of the war. U.S. merchant vessels were being attacked, both under U.S. and Panamanian flags, and U.S. warships were escorting convoys through combat zones. It was only a matter of time before U.S. warships found themselves in the fray. On September 4th, 1941, the USS Greer, a Wicks-class destroyer, was carrying mail and passengers to Iceland when it was informed by a British plane that a suspected U-boat was operating in the area. The submarine was the U-652. Following the terms of the Neutrality Patrol, the Greer located the submarine using sonar and broadcast its location to British and Canadian units, but did not attack. The Greer pursued the submarine for nearly 3 hours when, according to the U.S. Navy, the U-652 made a torpedo attack upon the Greer, which detected the torpedo launched by sonar. The torpedoes missed, and the Greer then proceeded to attack the submarine with depth charges. While the Navy initially said the outcome was undetermined, the U-652 survived, fought on until June of 1942. Roosevelt described what was called the Greer incident as an unprovoked attack, saying in a broadcast on September 11th, "I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer, without warning, with the deliberate design to sink her." He even declared the attack an act of piracy, because don't all great stories involve pirates? The German response was to claim that the Greer attacked with depth charges first, and that the submarine fired in self-defense. It's still not proven who fired first. It's possible that the U-652 mistook depth charges dropped from a British plane as coming from the Greer, but as critics noted at the time, the Greer had pursued the submarine for nearly 3 hours before the torpedo attack, something which would normally be considered a hostile act. Still, the Greer incident led Roosevelt to declare a new policy called shoot on sight. He opined, "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him." Under the new policy, if German or Italian warships were sighted in waters we deem necessary for our defense, the U.S. ships would attack them. The following month, the USS Kearny, a Benson-Livermore-class destroyer, was docked at Reykjavik when a nearby British convoy was attacked by a wolf pack of German U-boats. On October 17th, the Kearny and 3 other destroyers responded, and following the shoot-on-sight rules, attacked the submarines with depth charges. During the fight, the U-658 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at Kearny, one striking her amidships. While the crew was able to control the flooding and withdraw, 11 crew were killed and 22 injured. These were American combat casualties, nearly 2 months before the U.S. officially entered the war. 10 days later, Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio on Navy Day. He said, "We have wished to avoid shooting, but the shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot. America has been attacked. The USS Kearny is not just a Navy ship. She belongs to every man, woman, and child in this nation." 2 weeks later, on October 31st, the Clemson-class destroyer USS Reuben James was escorting a convoy when they got a high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, contact indicating a German submarine. The Reuben James moved to put herself between the suspected U-boat and the convoy and was struck by a torpedo fired by U-552, and apparently intended for one of the convoy's ships. The torpedo detonated the ship's forward magazine, blowing the bow off the ship. Chief Petty Officer William Bergstresser told the St. Petersburg Times, "I went topside and found that the whole forward part of the ship, including the bridge, was completely demolished and carried away." The bow section sank immediately. The stern section sank 5 minutes later. 100 members of the crew were killed, including all of the ship's officers. Reuben James was the first U.S. Navy ship sunk by hostile action in the European theater in World War II, and the worst single U.S. naval disaster since the sinking of the battleship Maine in 1898. The sinking starkly represented the fact that the Battle of the Atlantic was being fought even though war had not been declared. The New York Times noted that the sinking brushes away the last possible doubt that the United States and Germany are now at open war in the Atlantic. Folk singer Woody Guthrie immortalized the sinking in a song released in 1942. Have you heard of a ship called the good Reuben James, manned by hard-fighting men of both honor and fame? She flew the stars and stripes of the land of the free, but tonight she's in her grave at the bottom of the sea. Tell me, what were their names? Tell me, what were their names? Did you have a friend on the good Reuben James? The sinking of the Reuben James emboldened those members of Congress that were pressing for war. Texas Senator Tom Connally said, "This unjustified and dastardly sinking must be avenged." But the isolationists blamed Roosevelt. Vermont Senator George Aiken said that Roosevelt was personally responsible for the casualties. The sinking of the Reuben James might well have been that event that shifted public opinion and allowed FDR to take us to war, but the Japanese took away any need for that discussion when they bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Still, the incidents with the Greer, Kearny, and Reuben James were a casus belli for Germany. In their declaration of war against the United States on December 11th, German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop cited the shots fired by the three destroyers as open military acts of aggression and argued that the government of the United States has thereby virtually created a state of war. And of course, the Germans were absolutely right. The neutrality patrol was never neutral. FDR always intended to go as far towards intervention as the public would allow without destroying this fiction of neutrality. But FDR also argued that the United States would be in desperate shape if England were to fall and the Axis were to take all of Europe and Asia, and there seems to be a fair point of discussion there. Perhaps the question shouldn't be, was this undeclared war neutral? Because obviously it wasn't. The question was neutrality ever a viable option? And questions like that will keep historians busy for as long as we study history. But what is not a question is that the casualties of this undeclared war deserve to be remembered. Rarely is the drama of war seen more starkly than in the small ship actions of the Second World War's Battle of the Atlantic, where German submarines and the naval vessels built to fight them engaged in often lonely actions far out to sea where either vessel could easily be destroyed. The actions were short, sharp, and often terrifying for their crews. One such action represented a significant milestone, the first time a U.S. Navy vessel sank a German submarine off the coast of the United States in the Second World War, but the action was cloaked in secrecy. It was surrounded by controversy, and it wasn't even fully recounted until long after the war. The action on April 14, 1942, between the destroyer USS Roper and the German submarine U-85 deserves to be remembered. USS Roper was commissioned February of 1919, one of 111 Wicks-class destroyers built between 1917 and 1921. The Wicks class were among those called flush-deck destroyers because they did not have a raised forecastle like on previous classes, and also called four-stack destroyers for their four funnels. Like most vessels of the Wicks class, Roper came too late to participate in the Great War, although she was in service soon enough to participate in post-war relief activities. She also served in the Asiatic Squadron before being decommissioned and placed in reserve in 1922. Recommissioned in 1930, Roper served both in the Pacific and the Atlantic fleets. Noted science fiction author Robert Heinlein briefly served aboard Roper in 1933. In the fall of 1939, USS Roper was serving off of New England when it participated in the neutrality patrols. While officially remaining neutral, the ships of the Neutrality Patrol would patrol an area that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had designated as a protected zone that eventually went almost all the way to Iceland. Although at first, at least, the U.S. ships wouldn't attack the German submarines. They would merely report their location to British and Canadian ships. At the start of the war, U.S. naval assets were spread thin and largely unprepared for the German U-boat threat. Notably, the Navy had a significant shortage of vessels specialized for anti-submarine duties. U.S. losses to German U-boats along the East Coast were extreme. The first attacks in January 1942 were made by the large, long-range German Type 9 U-boats. Those attacks were so successful and the targets so plentiful that the German Navy followed by sending smaller Type 7 U-boats as well. These smaller submarines weren't built to operate so far abroad. They had to be literally crammed front to back with supplies and use special measures even to reach the United States. But still, the U.S. defense measures were so haphazard that even the Type 7 boats found significant success off the coast of the United States. By the end of March, the German U-boats had sunk more than 60 vessels off the U.S. East Coast and thousands of tons of shipping, much of it in the part of North Carolina's Outer Banks ominously called Torpedo Alley. In exchange, the United States Navy was yet to sink a single German U-boat. Roper, having returned from escorting a convoy to Ireland, was patrolling Torpedo Alley, the shipping lanes between Cape Hatteras and Chesapeake Bay, one of the too few U.S. vessels trying to stem the tide of the U-boat attacks. She was under the command of 38-year-old Lieutenant Commander Hamilton Wilcox Howe, a 1926 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. The duty was hazardous. In February, the Wicks-class destroyer Jacob Jones had been sunk by torpedoes from the U-578. Only 10 members of her crew had survived. Roper had had close calls in the early days of the Battle of the Atlantic. She had encountered a U-boat on the surface on January 19th, but the Roper's depth charge rack had jammed, and the U-boat captain had been able to escape. In March, they'd made contact with 3 U-boats on the surface, but the Roper was alone and only had 14 depth charges available. When the U-boats pursued Roper, Howe tried to get them to separate, but when they wouldn't, he was forced to outrun them rather than engage in a battle that would have been lopsided against Roper. The Roper had rescued many victims of U-boat attacks, including 27 survivors of the steamer SS New York in a lifeboat on March 31st. A pregnant woman had given birth on the lifeboat and had given the child the middle name Roper in recognition of the vessel that had rescued them. Roper was on patrol off North Carolina's Cape Hatteras the night of April 13th. The night was described as clear, with many stars visible. The sea was very nearly calm, the water phosphorescent. 6 minutes after midnight on the 14th, she acquired a radar contact, which was of a type that could have been a submarine. They weren't far from the coast, as the light from the Borie Island lighthouse, as well as the Borie Island lighted bell buoy number 8, were discernible to the ship's starboard. The radar contact was then confirmed with a soundman contact, which could hear rapidly turning screws. Roper could see the wake of the vessel in the phosphorescent water. As Roper approached within 2,100 yards, it still wasn't clear what vessel they were pursuing. They said it appeared to be a small Coast Guard vessel, but its speed indicated that it could still be a submarine, and so Roper was called to general quarters, and her weapons, including 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, 3-inch naval guns, depth charges, and torpedoes, were prepared for immediate action. At that point, the target, which had apparently become aware of Roper's pursuit, started to turn to port. Roper, aware there was a danger from torpedoes, moved for a position on the target's starboard quarter to make torpedo attack difficult. It was a good choice. As they approached within 700 yards, a torpedo was observed that narrowly missed Roper, passing close aboard down the port side. The Roper now knew this was an enemy, but it was not until they approached within 300 yards that the target cut sharply to starboard, and Roper's 24-inch searchlight illuminated it and identified it as a large submarine. The deck officer noted the submarine was painted with a camouflage, predominantly light in color. The submarine was the Type 7B U-boat U-85. Commissioned in June 1941, the U-85 was one of more than 700 Type 7 U-boats that comprised the backbone of the German U-boat fleet. The Type 7 was the most produced submarine type in history. The U-85, under the command of 26-year-old Oberlieutenant zur See Eberhard Greer, was on its 4th patrol and had already sunk more than 15,000 tons of Allied shipping, including the Swedish freighter Christina Knutsen, sunk off New Jersey, April 10th. Greer had the U-85 on the surface, likely charging his batteries, when it was spotted by Roper. He likely kept on the surface because the U-boat was much faster on the surface than it was submerged, and he had hoped to shake the Roper, but Roper had stayed on target. The U-85 had fired a torpedo from its aft tube at Roper, but when the torpedo missed, it became clear that the U-85 was going to have to stand and fight. Greer was turning the submarine in order to bring her deck gun to bear. The submarine had a tighter turning radius and was turning sharply to starboard. While the searchlight kept the submarine illuminated, Roper's guns went into action. First the machine guns and then the 3-inch battery. Forced into a fight, the submarine crew were rushing for their deck gun, but were cut down by the machine gun fire. A 3-inch gun under the command of coxswain Harry Hayman fired for its first time in combat, scored a hit on the conning tower at the waterline, puncturing the submarine's pressure hull, and the submarine began to sink, stern first. Howe ordered a torpedo attack, but the submarine disappeared before it was fired. Despite seeing approximately 40 members of the submarine's crew in the water, Roper fired a barrage of 11 depth charges over the submarine's location. In the darkness, they could not see wreckage. At the time, Roper made no attempt to rescue the crew of the U-85. Howe noted that the Roper at least twice came near survivors from the submarine. Coxswain Heron, who had fired the shot that crippled the U-boat, recalled in a journal hearing the Germans shouting, "Comrade," indicating surrender. But Hughes considered rescue attempts to be too dangerous at night because submarines were known to operate in pairs. As Heron noted, you were like a sitting duck every time you stopped to pick up survivors. Instead, Roper waited until morning, when a Catalina PBY operated by the Naval Reserve arrived and could watch over the area. By then, it was 7 a.m. The PBY noted suspicious oil slicks and debris. The plane dropped a depth charge on one potential target, and Roper dropped 2 more. More planes started to arrive, and one dropped markers called smoke floats near what appeared to be bodies in the water. Roper, now under the protection of aircraft, placed 2 boats in the water. As they searched, an airship arrived as well and began patrolling for evidence of more submarines. In all, Roper noted 7 aircraft arrived on scene. At 10 till 8, the first boat came back to Roper with 5 bodies. None of the U-boat crew were found alive. An hour later, as the ship was recovering bodies, the ship made another sonar contact and dropped 4 more depth charges. They observed 1 large air bubble and 1 small air bubble in addition to fresh oil. The airship, whose great advantage was the ability to stay on target for longer than an airplane, kept watch of the spot and noted that bubbles continued to come up. A marking buoy was dropped on the location, which, in view of the proximity of the bodies and debris, the sharp sound contact of an object which remained stationary, and the large air bubbles which persisted, Howe assumed, was the location of the sunken submarine. In all, Roper retrieved 29 bodies, including those of 2 officers. 2 more bodies were allowed to sink, and 15 empty life vests were found. 6 escape lungs were also recovered, and at least 2 of the bodies had mouthpiece tubing in their mouths, indicating they'd escaped after the submarine sank. Curiously, some of the bodies were wearing civilian clothes and carrying wallets with United States currency and identification cards, suggesting that part of the U-85's mission was to drop off spies. While destroying the first U-boat off the U.S. East Coast since the U.S. entered the war was significant, the U.S. was more interested in gaining intelligence from the U-85 and in keeping the German Navy in the dark as to what happened to the boat. The victory by Roper was not reported in the news. The bodies of the crew members were taken to Norfolk Naval Air Station to gather what intelligence they could find, and then were photographed, fingerprinted, and buried with honors after dusk on April 15th at Hamden National Cemetery. The coffins were carried by an honor guard. More than a dozen officers participated in the funeral. Final rites were said by both Catholic and Protestant chaplains. 24 sailors fired a 3-volley salute as a bugler paid taps. But the civilians standing outside the cemetery had no idea who was being buried. The headstones only included names, not ranks, nor service branch, nor date of death. A short statement was released in July describing the burial rites, but did not include the name of the submarine, the vessel that sank it, nor the date of its sinking. The full story was not released until after the war. Howe's decision to forego any rescue attempt for more than 7 hours after the vessel sank and to drop depth charges in the water despite knowing that there were survivors in the water is controversial to this day. But historian Clay Farrington of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum notes that you can't Monday morning quarterback this sort of thing. They didn't call them wolf packs for nothing. There might have been another U-boat in the water, waiting to take its shot. Moreover, Harrington noted that they would have known that the crew were intelligence assets. The Roper would have preferred to have taken them alive, if they could have. The U-85 sank in 110 feet of water. In the weeks after its sinking, U.S. Navy divers attempted to enter the wreck and see if they could recover the submarine's Enigma code machine, but they were unsuccessful. The submarine rescue vehicle USS Falcon also arrived and tried to salvage the U-85, but the damage to the pressure hull was too significant and they were unable to refloat the submarine. Lieutenant Commander Howe was awarded the Navy Cross for the action, and Coxswain Hayman was awarded the Silver Star. Howe later achieved the rank of Rear Admiral. Like many four-stackers, Roper was later converted into a high-speed transport. She served in the Mediterranean and then in the Pacific. On May 25, 1945, she was struck by a kamikaze off of Okinawa. The war ended before repairs could be completed, and she was finally scrapped in December 1946. USS Roper's anchor is on display at the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The wreck of the U-85 is a popular diving destination, and while the Coast Guard is moving to protect the wreck, several items have been recovered from the wreckage by divers, including a silver tea set and the missing Enigma code machine, which is now on display at the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras, North Carolina. The Battle of the Atlantic was a sprawling struggle across millions of square miles of ocean to protect sea lanes and supply routes that included as many as 1,000 single-ship actions. While those actions are easily forgotten in the broader context of the war, they truly represented the drama, the terror, and the heroism of the largest conflict in human history. By the fall of 1943, the tide was turning, and the Allies were moving from just defending their convoys to taking the fight to the U-boats themselves. But hunting U-boats across millions of square miles of ocean was a daunting and dangerous task, as the crew of the destroyer USS Borie and the German submarine U-405 would find out the night of Halloween, 1943, in a battle that the website HistoryNet describes as one of the most audacious and desperate sea battles ever. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Commissioned in March of 1920, USS Borie was a Clemson-class destroyer. The Clemson class were flush deckers, a minor redesign of the Wicks class, the product of the Naval Appropriation Act of August 29, 1916. Although they were outdated by the advent of the Second World War, the need for convoy defense and anti-submarine vessels kept many of the aging vessels at sea. While serviceable, a flaw in the fantail design limited their turning radius, a problem for vessels engaging in anti-submarine warfare. In June 1943, USS Borie was under the command of Lieutenant Charles Harris Hutchins, a 1936 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy from Terre Haute, Indiana. Hutchins had served aboard the battleship USS Nevada and destroyer USS Dorsey before resigning his commission in 1938 and entering the private sector. He was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Navy Reserve after Pearl Harbor and in December 1942 made executive officer of the Borie. He was promoted to command of the Borie on June 6, 1943. At age 30, Hutchins was the youngest commander of a destroyer in the United States Navy. Borie had done anti-submarine duty in the Caribbean at the outset of the war and then convoy escort in the South Atlantic. In June 1943, Borie was assigned to escort a convoy to the West African port of Casablanca, along with two other Clemson-class destroyers, USS Gulf and USS Borie. Arriving in Casablanca without incident, on July 30th, the three destroyers were assigned a different kind of escort duty on the return trip westward, joining the escort carrier, USS Card. Crewman Robert A. Mayer, lead fire controlman of the Borie, described the excitement. Upon clearing the harbor, we rendezvoused with an aircraft carrier. This was a hot damn situation, as we found we were one of the newly formed carrier escort groups. Card was a Bogue-class escort carrier commanded by Captain Arnold J. Buster Isbell, a 1920 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. These small carriers were converted from C-3 class cargo ships, displacing some 8,390 long tons that could carry up to about 24 aircraft. In this case, Card carried Navy Squadron VC-1 with 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 11 Grumman TBF-1 Avenger torpedo bombers. Slower, smaller, and more lightly armed than fleet carriers, escort carriers could be produced cheaply, and though not fast enough to keep up with fleet elements, were used for convoy escort. Mayer explains. The first such groups actually were part of the convoys and provided an air umbrella for the entire trip. Although the system was effective for deterring submarine attacks, it did little to solve the big problem of destroying the German U-boat fleet. But Card and her escorts would be changing tactics on the trip back westward. Mayer continues. Captain Isbell decided that it was not necessary to keep a continuous umbrella over the convoy. Instead, the group would operate independently against any reported concentration of U-boats and get back to the convoy, if needed. Isbell's idea represented a significant change in the tactics of the Battle of the Atlantic. Instead of merely protecting the convoys, the convoy escorts were now expected to seek out and attack concentrations of U-boats. Mayer explains. Captain Isbell's plan for using the task group in the westbound convoy from Casablanca was to both protect the convoy and to start the downfall of the U-boat campaign. The new tactic benefited from several advances in technology. High-frequency direction-finding equipment called Huff-Duff, a radio direction finder, combined with the Allies breaking the German code after the capture of code equipment from the U-110 in May of 1941, made the detection of U-boat concentrations very accurate. As the capture of the equipment had been kept a closely guarded secret, U-boat commanders continued to transmit, believing that their code was unbreakable. And in attack, the aircraft of VC-1 had the use of the Mark 24 mine, an airdrop torpedo that used a passive acoustic homing system called a FIDO by air crews, after the lab in which the weapon had been developed. Able to home in on the sound of a U-boat, a FIDO was approximately twice as effective as a standard airdropped depth charge. Upon return to the United States, Borie, Borie, and Goff received a quick refit, and Card and its escort went back to sea as a hunter-killer group. After leaving port, these groups rarely even saw the convoys they were escorting, instead operating independently to destroy the U-boats. As Mayer described the mission, our motto was to get them before they get us. But the destroyers were not so much the hunters as were the aircraft. Rather, Mayer notes, the primary job of the destroyers was to protect the carrier from submarine attacks at all costs. While they occasionally dropped depth charges on suspected U-boats, the hunting was largely done by the pilots of VC-1. Operating as a group required careful coordination, and the Clemson-class destroyers also had the task of rescuing downed-air crews. The group was highly effective. On the return trip to Casablanca, Carr's group received a commendation. Mayer says, the score so far was 4 confirmed sunk, 3 probably sunk, and 3 damaged. Good guys 10, Germans 0. In the cruise, the crew of Borie had learned much about the nature of war. Borie was assigned to pick up survivors of U-664, sunk by a Grumman Avenger on August 9th. Mayer said of the prisoners, they were for the most part frightened young men. When they recovered from their very close encounter with death and their natural apprehension about what would happen next, I'm sure they were just as surprised as we were to find out that the enemy was just other young boys. And those boys faced their own risk. While recovering the survivors, a salvo of torpedoes was fired at Borie from another U-boat. Torpedoes missed, but as a result, the escorts were ordered not to engage in further recovery operations. On the westward journey, the men of the task group faced another risk. As Mayer writes, we proceeded towards home without a problem. That is, unless you classify a destroyer in a hurricane a problem. 1943 was a violent hurricane year, and the Borie found itself in the middle of what was called Hurricane 3. Borie nearly lost steering control as equipment was damaged. It was a harrowing experience, Mayer wrote. Believe me, the destroyer crews would much rather take their chances with fighting submarines than going through one of those storms. However, I would soon rue the day that I had that thought. The group left Casablanca for another return trip west on October 20th. On October 30th, somewhere between the Azores and Iceland, aircraft from the Card caught 2 U-boats on the surface. U-584 was destroyed by a Fido, but another, U-91, managed to submerge and escape. Isbell suspected that the second U-boat might be a milch cow, large submarines meant to supply other U-boats to allow them to remain at patrol longer. Knowing the importance of such a target, Borie was sent to investigate the submarine's last location. Mayer wrote, Captain Hutchins informed us over the sound system that we had volunteered to search for the escaping U-boat. Amidst the cheers of all hands, at sunset and with moderate seas, we set off for the area of last contact. We young bucks, dumb and happy, were really excited. We were the hunters, not the hunted. It was an exhilarating feeling for all of us. Reaching the area, Borie found a sonar contact, dropping depth charges. They'd found a U-boat, although later it was determined not to be the U-91, but another submarine, the U-256. The depth charges caused the boat to surface, but it managed to submerge again. Another salvo created an oil slick. Hutchins suspected that the boat had been destroyed, but in fact, U-256 was damaged, but managed to escape. In the brief fight, Borie had had a stroke of luck. When they first made sonar contact, the U-256 had been in perfect position to fire at Borie from its aft torpedoes. But due to the recent effectiveness of aircraft against the U-boats, U-256 had been converted for anti-aircraft fire. The aft torpedoes had been removed to allow storage for more anti-aircraft ammunition. Mayer wrote, the episode was one of those strange twists of fate. Because the U-91 escaped, we found it damaged the U-256. And because U-91 escaped, fate was soon to deal us an even bigger hand. Still searching the area, at 1:53 a.m. on November 1st, Borie got yet another sonar contact, bearing 170, range 8,000 yards. It was the German submarine, U-405. Commanded by 37-year-old Corvette Captain Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, the U-405 was commissioned in September 1941. U-405 was a Type 7C U-boat, the most common type produced by the Germans during the war. Hauptmann and his crew were experienced. The Corvette captain had earned the U-boat War Badge, Iron Cross Second Class, Iron Cross First Class, and Knight's Cross. On the boat was on its 8th war patrol. The seas were high, as much as 20 feet, washing over the Borie. The flush deckers did not have a raised forecastle like newer designs, and thus the bow tended to be wet in high seas. Waves crashed so hard that they broke out portals in the Borie's highest towers, 30 feet above the sea. A 2007 edition of the Terre Haute Tribune-Star wrote that when Borie got directly over its target, Hutchins told torpedo man Frank G. Cronin to drop an orthodox deep pattern of depth charges. He did. However, due to a malfunction, Borie's entire inventory of depth charges rolled inadvertently into the sea in an endless procession. Multiple explosions lifted the destroyer's stern. While many crew assumed the submarine could not have survived these explosions, in fact, they merely drove U-405 to the surface. The website of the German U-Boat Museum writes, being severely damaged and unserviceable for further diving, Operation had it to surface unless it wanted to accept death in the depth. Mayer later wrote, "Looking back towards our marker flare, I was the first to see it. The conning tower of the U-405. I cried out, not in true Navy fashion, 'There it is, about 40 feet to the right of the flare.'" Hutchins wrote in his report, "We came hard around to the right and started to pursue him using the searchlight. The crew of the submarine opened fire with its 20mm anti-aircraft guns, but before the crew could reach the 8.8cm deck gun," Hutchins reports, "our second or third salvo of the main battery struck the submarine just under this gun, and when the smoke cleared away, the gun was gone, without firing a shot." Hauptmann was experienced and was utilizing the U-boat's superior turning radius, trying to angle the boat to make a torpedo attack on the Borie, but the Tribune Star writes, "Hutchins matched Hauptmann's skill, keeping the Borie's guns pointed at the sub despite the larger turning circle, while avoiding Hauptmann's effort to point its torpedo tube at his ship." Hutchins reported, "We closed to ram with our 20mm guns sweeping their decks completely clear, the 4-inch scoring some effective hits at this time." The U-Boat Museum writes, "In between tracer ammunition of the U-boat's AA gun was fired. Steam was hissing, shouting everywhere, discharging of cannons and rattling of machine guns. One could spot the scenery in the pale light of the muzzle flash. Deaths and wounded, between orders, shouted, and even more screaming." Mayer reported, "Watching the results of the converging streams of 20mm bullets was both horrifying and fascinating." The boats were running parallel, Borie slightly behind. They were so close that Mayer said, "Looking down, I could see clearly the faces of the Germans still on the bridge." Hutchins ordered helmsman James N. Aikenhead to line her up and get the sight on, and then yelled, "All stations, stand by for ram." Mayer said, "I closed my eyes, held my breath, and prayed." At the last minute, Hauptmann tried to avoid the ram. The submarine's turn created a surge of water that lifted the Borie up, came across the U-405, pinning it. The Tribune Star explains, the two ships came to rest, bow over bow, at an angle. The U-Boat Museum writes, "The two vessels, hanging to one another, were moving against each other, up and down, from wave crest to wave trough in the rough sea, causing a noise of cracking steel and adding to the din of firing and shouting." The order to ram the Borie distributed small arms to the deck crew. Pinned together, Mayer wrote, "Two gallant crews were engaged in fierce battle, using every kind of weapon at their disposal. Borie was firing all its guns, but the boats were so close that the main guns could not depress enough to hit the submarine. The U-boat was so close that one of the machine gun batteries was blocked by its own gun shield. The gunners merely fired through their own shield. The crew fought with small arms, firing Tommy guns and shotguns that were carried for riot control. At least one U-boat crewman was killed by a pistol shot, another knocked overboard by a thrown knife. One was hit in the chest by a flare, and others knocked overboard as crew threw spent ammunition cartridges from the 4-inch guns." For their part, the U-Boat Museum writes, "The German U-boat sailors threw hand grenades, hit back with empty cartridges, and fired signal pistols at the destroyer sailors." Meanwhile, another desperate battle was going on below the decks of Borie, where the U-boat's diving tail had punctured the destroyer's hull and the forward engine room was flooding. Crewmen were trying to staunch the flow by stuffing mattresses in the breach. Hutchins wrote, "The crew of the forward engine room maintained flank speed of that engine, even though they were standing in water up to their necks, with the turbines operating underwater." After 10 minutes of firefight, the submarine broke free and tried to make distance, again trying to bring its aft torpedoes to bear. Hauptmann launched a torpedo, but it went wide. Hutchins was trying to maneuver for another ram. Borie fired a torpedo, but it barely missed. Hutchins ordered his searchlight turned off, assuming the U-boat would try to make distance, but still followed the boat with radar. As the U-boat pulled away, Hutchins turned and had the searchlight turned on again, allowing all his batteries to bear. The U-405 was in shambles, and most of its crew dead, but it continued to fight. Now it was Hauptmann's turn to try to ram the Borie, firing a spread of torpedoes. Hutchins ordered a hard right, using not just the rudder but the engines to make a sharp turn, and the torpedoes missed. Borie launched a spread of depth charges from its side-firing Y guns, striking home. The Star Tribune writes, "The submarine leaped from the water like a wounded whale, stopping only inches before colliding with Borie." Now dead in the water, Hauptmann tried to restart the engines, trying once again to escape, but the boat was being raked with fire from Borie. A 4-inch round struck the rear exhaust port, and a direct hit on the conning tower. The U-Boat Museum writes, "Swept Commander Hauptmann and the men in the conning tower overboard." Finally, the few remaining crew on the U-boat surrendered. The U-Boat Museum writes, "At 2:57 a.m. in the morning of the 1st of November, 1943, exactly 72 minutes after the first battle encounter, U-405 sank, bow ahead, and exploding soon after being underwater." Hutchins wrote in his report, "When the submarine sank, there was a yell that went up from all hands. It probably could be heard in Berlin." There were survivors from the U-boat in the water, but crew from the Borie witnessed a flare going off in the distance that appeared to be a signal from another U-boat, and it was decided that it was too risky to try any recovery operations. Hutchins, in his report, expressed hope that the other U-boat might have rescued some of those survivors, but the U-Boat Museum reports that there were no survivors from U-405. Borie began a desperate struggle to save the ship, which was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. Hutchins ordered heavy equipment thrown overboard, and only a token amount of ammunition for the main battery was retained to try to lighten weight. But with the storm approaching and no realistic chance that a tug could arrive to take the ship to port, Hutchins was forced to order abandoned ship. While no crew had been killed in the battle, 3 officers and 24 crew were lost in the rescue operation. Some when USS Borie collided with a raft in the dark. Many simply too exhausted to make it to the rescuing destroyers. Somehow the stricken Borie managed to remain afloat, but Card needed its escorts on station and the decision was made to sink her. But she didn't go down easy. When 4-inch fire from Borie and Goff proved ineffective, she was finally sunk by a depth charge from one of Card's Avengers. The 2019 book Destroyers in Action described the more than hour-long fight between USS Borie and the U-405 as one of the most desperate ship-to-ship actions in the annals of sea fighting. Charles Hutchins was the last man to leave USS Borie, using a flashlight to make sure that no one else was aboard. Carried with him the ship's colors. That flag now resides in the Smithsonian Institution. For his actions that night, he was awarded the Navy Cross, one of 3 awarded to crewmen of the Borie for the fight. He passed away 1992, at the age of 79. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.